My naive fiancée fell in love with a mechanic. To be with him, she deliberately ruined the 999 roses I had carefully prepared for her at our engagement party. She looked at me as if I were her enemy. "You posh boys only know how to indulge yourselves. Isn't your money just your parents' anyway? Have you ever worked hard with your own hands?" she said. "He's different. I love how charming he looks when he's pursuing his dreams and working up a sweat. I'd be happy to eat weeds if I'm with him." I could only smile bitterly. We had grown up together, companions for over a decade. Yet I never imagined this was how she saw me in her heart. I didn't say anything more, choosing to let go and give her my blessing. Ding! Story Shots reminds you to click the subscribe button at the bottom right corner to read the full novel. To clear my head, I decided to go work on a project in Africa. I ended up staying for 3 years. When I returned, I heard she had been married to that mechanic for 2 years already. She had even had a few children with him. Just when I thought she had gotten everything she wanted, she snuck into my bed wearing revealing clothes at my heir announcement party. Her eyes were full of wrinkles, her hands rough. The beauty she had once prided herself on was gone. She sobbed quietly, "Crispin, I regret it. Can we go back to how things were? You don't know how disgusting it is to sleep next to that man every night. The stench of his sweat is enough to kill me. Crispin, after this party, we'll have to call you Mr. Calvert. Who would have thought that after 3 years in Africa, you'd quietly pull off such a massive project?" At the inheritance gala, I smiled and clinked glasses with those business partners amidst the bustling atmosphere. 3 years had been enough for me to achieve success and fame. After inheriting my father's company, all the partners had their eyes on my projects, fawning over me. Seeing my current carefree demeanor, some couldn't help but mention Winifred Ferrier, who had abandoned me at our engagement party years ago. However, when they spoke of Winifred now, their tone was mostly contemptuous. If Winifred Ferrier knew about this, she'd surely regret it, giving up the chance to be Mrs. Calvert to marry a mechanic. Now, Mr. Calvert isn't someone just anyone can aspire to marry. As soon as these words were uttered, many people snickered. My expression turned cold, and they fell silent, not daring to mention Winifred again. Coincidentally, the hotel chosen for this inheritance gala was the same one where that engagement party had been held years ago. In a daze, I once again saw the image of Winifred trampling on the 999 roses I had carefully prepared for her. Her expression had been haughty, looking at me as if I were her enemy. "Without your family's support, you're nothing but a spoiled rich boy. Spencer may be a mechanic, but I can chase dreams with him, and will definitely have a better life than with you." It was after hearing these words that I became disheartened and volunteered to go to Africa for the project. 3 years had passed, and I had heard bits about Winifred's current situation, but I thought she must have gotten what she wanted. "Crispin, mate, look over there. Isn't that Winifred Ferrier?" Gareth Elston, my friend standing beside me, nudged my shoulder and pointed at a cleaner standing at the edge of the party. Following his gesture, I glanced at the cleaner whose figure was strikingly similar to Winifred's, but hesitated to confirm. It can't be. How could Winifred have fallen so low as to become a cleaner? When Winifred had insisted on eloping with the mechanic, the Ferrier family had cut ties with her completely. But she should have had considerable savings. It seemed impossible that she would end up in such a dire situation, having to work as a hotel cleaner. As I hesitated to deny it, the cleaner started walking towards me. As she got closer, I could see more clearly. It really was Winifred. In just 3 years, she had lost the beauty she once prided herself on. Her eyes were lined with wrinkles, and her entire body was as dark and thin as a piece of coal. When our eyes met, I saw the spring of emotion in Winifred's gaze. Even though she was stopped by the security guards, she still looked at me with deep affection. "Crispin, it's been a long time. How have you been?" I coldly watched Winifred trying to reconnect with me and instructed the security to take her away. Hearing this, Winifred frowned at me. She looked down at her cleaning uniform as if hurt. "Crispin, we grew up together. Are you really going to distance yourself from me just because I'm a cleaner now? You're still as snobbish as before." Gareth could no longer contain his anger. He rushed out from the crowd, pointing at Winifred and shouting, "You ruined the engagement party and left without a word back then. Now you suddenly show up at my brother's inheritance party. Why do you have to keep pestering him?" Winifred glanced at the furious Gareth but sighed unexpectedly. Her eyes reddened as she looked at me. "We've known each other for so many years. I came specially to congratulate you. You've misunderstood me." She even choked up a bit. "Even if you hate me for ruining our engagement party, I've never forgotten you. I just want a chance to make amends." Others might not have noticed, but I could see clearly. There wasn't a hint of sadness in Winifred's eyes, only the joy of thinking she had me figured out. She was convinced that I loved her deeply, that with just a crook of her finger, I would follow her like a lovesick puppy. The entire room fell silent, waiting for my response. I chuckled softly and deliberately extended my hand towards the seemingly pitiful Winifred. She thought I was going to take her hand and coyly batted her eyelashes at me. Instead, she saw me turn my hand over, revealing the wedding ring on my left ring finger, sparkling brilliantly under the lights. "I'm sorry, but I'm already engaged." Winifred's smug expression froze on her face. She stared blankly at the wedding ring on my finger, rooted to the spot. Even as the security guards led her away, she kept her eyes fixed on me, as if I had betrayed her. The heir's celebration was held at my estate, with fireworks purchased especially to congratulate me on inheriting the company. As soon as the time came, Gareth Elston eagerly pulled me outside. Having just returned to the country not long ago, I had been busy taking over the family business, too exhausted to rest. The accumulated fatigue was eroding me, and the resentful look in Winifred Ferrier's eyes when she was taken away made my brow throb with pain. The fireworks were dazzling and brilliant, but I watched them in a daze. On the day of the engagement party, Winifred Ferrier had hurriedly left after trampling the roses, leaving me alone. I could only stand there with a bitter smile, watching alone the fireworks that were meant to celebrate our engagement. In secondary school, I had once asked Winifred Ferrier what she would want most if someone proposed to her in the future. At that time, Winifred Ferrier's eyes were full of tenderness, and the shyness of a young girl always carried a touch of gentleness. She said, "I want the grandest fireworks display. Under the fireworks, he should have 999 roses ready." Roses and fireworks, I had done it all. But just thinking about that day's scene made me feel somewhat desolate and increasingly weary. I didn't want to recall those painful memories anymore. Yet Winifred Ferrier appeared once again, wearing her school uniform. The people around me saw her faster than I did, and they mocked mercilessly. Winifred Ferrier? Wasn't she already taken away by security? Why has she come back now in a school uniform? What else could it be? Mr. Calvert and she were secondary school classmates. Seeing that Mr. Calvert won't forgive her, she's now trying to play on his nostalgia. It was then that I realized Winifred Ferrier hadn't left at all, but had deliberately changed into her secondary school uniform and returned to face me. Although the uniform was well preserved, it was inevitably yellowed, bearing unmistakable signs of age. Under the sky full of fireworks, Winifred Ferrier seemed to have returned to our school days, attempting to take me back to those memories. She looked at me with deep affection, but the wrinkles on her face that couldn't be hidden looked increasingly ridiculous against the backdrop of the school uniform. "Crispin, do you remember? It was in this very uniform that I accepted your confession back then. We were both so naive then, but when I knew you liked me too, I was so happy. I felt like the luckiest girl in the world." Seeing my expression remain cold, Winifred Ferrier became increasingly upset. "I know you've always remembered what I said to you then. On the day of the engagement party, I saw the fireworks too." After a moment of silence, she took a rose from her pocket. Though having been hidden there, it was already somewhat withered when she took it out. "I wronged you at the engagement party back then. Now I want to make it up to you. Okay? Crispin, I truly love you." I don't believe that all our years of affection could disappear in just 3 short years. I could no longer suppress the sneer in my throat. The promise made in our youth stuck in my throat, making me feel increasingly nauseated. Winifred Ferrier's ridiculous actions only made others look down on her even more. Many people were indignant on my behalf. 1 rose? Does she think too highly of herself? What makes her think she's worthy of Mr. Calvert? Just because she's his ex-girlfriend. She talks about compensating Mr. Calvert, but with Mr. Calvert's status, what doesn't he have? What compensation could Winifred Ferrier, now just a cleaner, possibly offer him? It's just an excuse to cling to Mr. Calvert. She's ruined what should have been a good heirs celebration. How is this loving Crispin Calvert? This is clearly deliberate revenge. Under everyone's gaze, I stepped forward and took the rose. Then I threw it into the rubbish bin. I replied with a cold smile. Take your love to the rubbish bin. You're not the Winifred Ferrier from back then, and I'm certainly not the Crispin Calvert I was. If you had been like this back then, I would never have fallen for you. I would only have felt disgusted. Out of respect for your parents, I'll leave you with a last shred of dignity. Leave on your own, and don't ever appear before me again. As soon as I finished speaking, Winifred Ferrier rushed forward and held onto me tightly, her tears quickly soaking my clothes. Crispin, I truly regret it. Really. Give me one more chance, please. Let's start over. This time, let me pursue you. Okay? Can you really bear to forget all our happy memories from before? I was about to call for security when I heard a familiar, good-natured male voice. Crispin Calvert, get your hands off my wife. The heirs celebration was held at my estate, with fireworks purchased especially to congratulate me on inheriting the company. As soon as the time came, Gareth Elston eagerly pulled me outside. Having just returned to the country not long ago, I had been busy taking over the family business, too exhausted to rest. The accumulated fatigue was eroding me, and the resentful look in Winifred Ferrier's eyes when she was taken away made my brow throb with pain. The fireworks were dazzling and brilliant, but I watched them in a daze. On the day of the engagement party, Winifred Ferrier had hurriedly left after trampling the roses, leaving me alone. I could only stand there with a bitter smile, watching alone the fireworks that were meant to celebrate our engagement. In secondary school, I had once asked Winifred Ferrier what she would want most if someone proposed to her in the future. At that time, Winifred Ferrier's eyes were full of tenderness, and the shyness of a young girl always carried a touch of gentleness. She said, I want the grandest fireworks display. Under the fireworks, he should have 999 roses ready. Roses and fireworks, I had done it all. But just thinking about that day's scene made me feel somewhat desolate and increasingly weary. I didn't want to recall those painful memories anymore. Yet Winifred Ferrier appeared once again, wearing her school uniform. The people around me saw her faster than I did, and they mocked mercilessly. Winifred Ferrier? Wasn't she already taken away by security? Why has she come back now in a school uniform? What else could it be? Mr. Calvert and she were secondary school classmates. Seeing that Mr. Calvert won't forgive her, she's now trying to play on his nostalgia. It was then that I realized Winifred Ferrier hadn't left at all, but had deliberately changed into her secondary school uniform and returned to face me. Although the uniform was well preserved, it was inevitably yellowed, bearing unmistakable signs of age. Under the sky full of fireworks, Winifred Ferrier seemed to have returned to our school days, attempting to take me back to those memories. She looked at me with deep affection, but the wrinkles on her face that couldn't be hidden looked increasingly ridiculous against the backdrop of the school uniform. Crispin, do you remember? It was in this very uniform that I accepted your confession back then. We were both so naive then, but when I knew you liked me too, I was so happy. I felt like the luckiest girl in the world. Seeing my expression remain cold, Winifred Ferrier became increasingly upset. I know you've always remembered what I said to you then. On the day of the engagement party, I saw the fireworks too. After a moment of silence, she took a rose from her pocket. Though having been hidden there, it was already somewhat withered when she took it out. I wronged you at the engagement party back then. Now I want to make it up to you. Okay? Crispin, I truly love you. I don't believe that all our years of affection could disappear in just 3 short years. I could no longer suppress the sneer in my throat. The promise made in our youth stuck in my throat, making me feel increasingly nauseated. Winifred Ferrier's ridiculous actions only made others look down on her even more. Many people were indignant on my behalf. 1 rose? Does she think too highly of herself? What makes her think she's worthy of Mr. Calvert? Just because she's his ex-girlfriend. She talks about compensating Mr. Calvert, but with Mr. Calvert's status, what doesn't he have? What compensation could Winifred Ferrier, now just a cleaner, possibly offer him? It's just an excuse to cling to Mr. Calvert. She's ruined what should have been a good heirs celebration. How is this loving Crispin Calvert? This is clearly deliberate revenge. Under everyone's gaze, I stepped forward and took the rose. Then I threw it into the rubbish bin. I replied with a cold smile. Take your love to the rubbish bin. You're not the Winifred Ferrier from back then, and I'm certainly not the Crispin Calvert I was. If you had been like this back then, I would never have fallen for you. I would only have felt disgusted. Out of respect for your parents, I'll leave you with a last shred of dignity. Leave on your own, and don't ever appear before me again. As soon as I finished speaking, Winifred Ferrier rushed forward and held onto me tightly, her tears quickly soaking my clothes. Crispin, I truly regret it. Really. Give me one more chance, please. Let's start over. This time, let me pursue you. Okay? Can you really bear to forget all our happy memories from before? I was about to call for security when I heard a familiar, good-natured male voice. Crispin Calvert, get your hands off my wife. The previously relaxed tension suddenly tightened. I held my breath and slowly opened my eyes, meeting Winifred Ferrier's gaze as she sat on top of me. My pajamas had already been unbuttoned completely, while Winifred was scantily clad. Her rough fingers continued to caress my body. Seeing that I was awake, she didn't stop her movements and said through tears, Crispin, I regret it. Let's go back to how things were. You don't know how disgusting it is to sleep next to that man every night. The stench of his sweat is enough to kill me. After everything, I've realized you're still the best. The room was filled with the scent of roses, the cheap perfume masking the bitter smell of the drug. My body was powerless, and I could only watch helplessly as Winifred undid my clothes, my eyes brimming with tears. Weren't you taken away by Aubrey? I managed to ask. Winifred stopped crying. Her face still bore a bright red handprint, but beneath the feigned humiliation was a smile of triumph. Seeing her plan succeed, she lost interest in keeping up the act. If I had left, who would become Mrs. Calvert? She sneered. Don't worry, after tonight, no matter who you're engaged to, the position of Mrs. Calvert can only be mine. As soon as she finished speaking, a commotion erupted outside the room. A group of reporters broke through the security guard's blockade and burst in with their cameras. Camera flashes continued incessantly as Winifred trembled on top of me, as if crying. Only I knew she was actually laughing. Winifred's voice, choked with fake sobs, echoed around the room, accompanied by the constant click of camera shutters. Mr. Calvert, must you abuse your power like this? I've already told you I'm married, yet you still force me to be with you. That engagement party years ago, you were the one who abandoned me, forcing me to marry a mechanic. Now you claim I'm your first love, that you've never forgotten me. As Winifred wailed, the reporters she had arranged beforehand chimed in. Some even approached the bed, cameras aimed at my face. Mr. Calvert, do you have anything to say? Today is your heir appointment ceremony. Does your fiancé know you're rekindling an old flame with your first love at such an event? We've heard your current fiancée is a famous actress. Now that you're having an affair with a married woman, does this mean the future Mrs. Calvert position is still up for grabs? Seeing the situation unfold exactly as she had planned, Winifred couldn't hold back a muffled laugh. She leaned close to my ear and whispered, See, Mr. Calvert? I told you I'm your true soulmate. Her finger traced my exposed chest, her eyes flashing with greed. Don't worry, we'll never be apart again. We'll spend the rest of our lives together. With that, Winifred stared intently at me, trying to detect even the slightest hint of fear on my face. As strength gradually returned to my body, I showed no fear, only disdain for Winifred's clumsy scheme. I sneered in response. Did you really think I hadn't noticed you drugging me? That overpowering cheap rose perfume. I smelled it the moment I entered the room. I just wanted to see what other tricks you had up your sleeve. Glancing at the reporters still crowded around the bed, I smirked and said mockingly to the now ashen-faced Winifred, "If you thought these amateur tactics could subdue me, you're even more pathetic than I imagined." After Winifred's outburst at my heir appointment ceremony, I had already been on guard against her. Before retiring to my bedroom to rest, I had instructed Gareth Elston to follow Aubrey and Winifred as I watched them leave the estate. I told him to make sure they actually left the grounds. By the time I reached the third floor, I received a message from Gareth. He first sent me a photo. Aubrey was unconscious in a roadside ditch, his head bloodied, while Winifred had apparently snuck back onto the estate. Gareth had Aubrey sent to the hospital and warned me to be careful, saying Winifred was relentless and would surely continue to harass me. "Sir, this woman has gone mad. Who knows what depraved acts she'll commit if we let her carry on. She was even ruthless enough to bash her own husband's head in. Should we?" I didn't let Gareth take rash action. I had already lost patience with Winifred's repeated harassment. This time, I would ensure she never had another chance to bother me again. "Stop right there. Put those cameras down. You lot must be mad to try and cause trouble at the Calvert estate. Thinking of broadcasting this? I'll have you know the internet's been cut off on the grounds. Don't bother struggling if you know what's good for you." Gareth Elston burst in with a group of security guards, quickly taking control of the reporters and confiscating their cameras and video equipment. I scanned the reporters, but not one dared meet my gaze. It seemed they had only just remembered that I had inherited the shares and now controlled the most powerful media corporation in the country. With just a word, I could end their careers in the industry. The reporters Winifred had bribed fell to their knees, begging for mercy. The smug looks on their faces had vanished, replaced by sheer panic. In their desperation, some pointed at Winifred, trying to shift all the blame onto her. "Mr. Calvert, it was all Winifred Ferrier's doing. She forced us to come, saying she was the future Mrs. Calvert and this was just a game between you two. We're just small-time reporters. We'd never dare offend the Calvert family. Please, sir, have mercy and let us go." Watching the reporters plead, I couldn't help but find it amusing. I turned to Winifred with a mocking gaze, more interested in seeing her reaction to being betrayed than in the reporter's lies. Winifred's face flushed red with anger. She could no longer keep up her act and lashed out at the lead reporter. "I forced you to come? How dare you say that? If you hadn't thought there was something to gain, that this was some earth-shattering news you could use to blackmail the Calverts, would you have ever agreed to my plan?" No one answered Winifred's accusations. Still, she refused to give up. Taking advantage of a moment when the guards were distracted, she leapt from the bed and snatched a camera from a nearby reporter, desperately trying to transmit the compromising photos of us. But she could only watch helplessly as the loading icon spun endlessly, with no sign of progress. Realizing she had been outmaneuvered, Winifred's legs gave way. She collapsed to the floor, glaring at me with hatred. "You knew. You knew all along." Her eyes were bloodshot. Her whole being like a demon crawled up from hell as she screamed at me hoarsely. "Did you enjoy making a fool of me, Crispin Calvert? Do you have any heart at all?" Gareth helped me up from the bed as the guards had already opened the windows to air out the room. Though the drugs were wearing off, I still felt weak. But my words rang out clearly as I calmly responded to Winifred's accusations. "You were the one who plotted against me, yet you dare question me? Never mind whether I have a heart or not. How does your own conscience feel about knocking Aubrey unconscious with a brick?" My cold words shattered what little hope Winifred had left. In utter despair, she made one last desperate move. Before anyone could react, Winifred clutched the camera to her chest and bolted for the door. Her actions only mildly surprised me. She barely made it a few steps before the guards restrained her, leaving her with nothing to do but curse at me. I took the camera from her arms and glanced at the compromising photos inside, letting out a cold laugh. Right in front of Winifred, I smashed the camera to pieces. Not stopping there, I had every electronic device capable of taking photos confiscated and destroyed. When it was all done, I looked at Winifred with a sneer, surrounded by the wreckage and the terrified reporters. "You'll be responsible for all the damages caused today." A lawyer who had been standing by presented a freshly printed contract, which Winifred had to sign before she could leave. To my surprise, Winifred seemed to realize the situation was beyond salvaging. Though hatred still burned in her eyes, she signed the contract without fuss and limped away. With that settled, I moved to another master bedroom to rest. As I lay in bed, finally allowing myself to relax a bit, I received a message from my mother. She informed me that Winifred's parents would be joining us for the family dinner in 3 days' time. Having heard about Winifred's outburst at my inheritance ceremony, they wanted to apologize to me in person. Winifred's parents had watched me grow up. Despite the awkward situation between Winifred and me, I still felt indebted to them. I agreed without hesitation. A moment later, my mother couldn't resist asking about Jillian's recent activities. I calculated the dates and realized the award ceremony would be held on the same day as our dinner. Jillian likely wouldn't be able to make it back. My mother was clearly disappointed to hear this. I teased her, saying, "Jillian and I are already engaged. She's just busy with work now, but we'll have plenty of chances to see each other in the future." After the party, I thought 3 days would feel like an eternity for me. To my surprise, once I actually took over my father's position, I was so busy I could barely catch my breath. It was my secretary who reminded me it was time for the family dinner. When I got home, Uncle Ferrier opened the door for me. He looked eager and quickly ushered me to sit down. Aunt Ferrier and my mother were sitting on the sofa. Aunt Ferrier's eyes were red-rimmed, and my mother was holding her, comforting her softly. They had been best friends for years, and Winifred and I had been betrothed since childhood. But ever since Winifred ran away with that mechanic, Aunt Ferrier had fallen ill with worry and her health had been poor. As soon as I entered, Aunt Ferrier kept looking at me, seemingly wanting to speak but hesitating. I took the initiative to sit next to her and said, "She's not doing too badly." At least she was quite articulate when she came to see me. I deliberately used a light-hearted tone to comfort Aunt Ferrier, not wanting her to dwell on those unpleasant matters. Hearing my words, Aunt Ferrier seemed to relax a bit. She held my hand and said, "Crispin, it's Auntie who has let you down. If only earlier." I gave her a reassuring smile, interrupting her, "It's all in the past. I'm your godson, we're family, and there's no need for such talk between us." The television was broadcasting the BAFTA Awards ceremony live. As the camera panned across Jillian sitting in the audience, my gaze couldn't help but soften. Seeing that I was drawn to the TV, Aunt Ferrier's furrowed brow finally relaxed. She changed the subject, saying, "That's your fiancée, isn't it? Oh, you two really are a perfect match. When you get married, your godmother will definitely give you a big wedding gift." After chatting for a while, it was almost time for dinner. I called out to my father, who was busy in the kitchen. "Dad, add 3 more place settings. We have guests coming today." My father looked puzzled upon hearing this, but he still set out 3 additional sets of dishes and cutlery. As I had anticipated, after a few drinks, there was a series of heavy knocks on the front door. My father was about to get up, but I beat him to it and went to open the door. As soon as the door opened, Winifred, who had been standing outside, barged in. She was clutching a piece of paper tightly in her hand. She made no attempt to hide it, even deliberately letting me see its contents. It was a pregnancy test result. Aunt Ferrier, seeing her daughter appear before her after many years, abruptly stood up. Perhaps because she rose too quickly, she bumped into the table, causing a muffled thud from underneath. However, no one paid any attention to it. Everyone's gaze was fixed on Winifred. Aunt Ferrier's voice was trembling uncontrollably. Seeing Winifred's much-aged face, her barely held composure began to crumble once again. "Darling, how have you been lately? Mummy has really, really missed you." By the end, Aunt Ferrier was nearly choking up, tears rolling down her cheeks. Winifred's brow was furrowed with resentment. Hearing her mother's call, she spat viciously and pointed at Aunt Ferrier, cursing with disgust. "You don't deserve to call me your daughter. I've suffered so much out there all these years. Have you ever given me any help? I must have had the worst luck in the world to be born into the Ferrier family. Let me tell you, this is what you owe me, and I'll make sure to get it back from you with interest sooner or later." Aunt Ferrier, being pointed at and insulted by her own daughter, turned pale and swayed, almost unable to stand. Uncle Ferrier quickly steadied Aunt Ferrier. Enraged by Winifred, he roared at her, "Get out! Get out of here! We don't have a daughter like you." Winifred sneered at Uncle Ferrier's outburst, then turned to my parents with a sweet smile. "Dad, Mom, I've come to share some good news with you today." Ignoring my parents' stunned expressions, she stepped forward to the dining table and slammed the pregnancy test result onto it. "I'm pregnant with Crispin's child. From now on, we'll be even closer family. Isn't that wonderful?" My parents didn't look at Winifred, but stared straight at me until they saw me shake my head slightly. Only then did they seem to breathe a sigh of relief. My mother, having watched Winifred grow up, still had some affection for her. Seeing Winifred like this, she couldn't help but feel some sympathy. "Winifred, if you truly regret marrying that mechanic, just apologize to your parents. At worst, you can get a divorce and come back home. Crispin is already engaged to Jillian. Even if you cling to him, you can't." Winifred cut off my mother's words. She held up the pregnancy test result for everyone to see, her uncontrollable glee mixed with an undeniable hint of madness. "I'm pregnant. Can't you all see? I'm carrying Crispin's child. I'm the future Mrs. Calvert." She turned her gaze to her pale-faced mother and still fuming father, shouting out of control, "You've always looked down on Aubrey, haven't you? Well, now I'm pregnant with Crispin's child. Are you finally satisfied?" My smile grew wider as I deliberately walked up to Winifred's side, allowing her to continue her tirade. But then I suddenly asked a pointed question. "None of Aubrey's children survived. What makes you think my child would?" Winifred answered almost without hesitation, "Of course it will. We're truly in love, and I'll certainly love our child. I never loved Aubrey, and I would never have wanted to have his children." I made no comment on Winifred Ferrier's declaration of love, merely clapping my hands and lowering my gaze to the dining table. "Did you hear that, Aubrey? This is the woman you've been in love with all along," I said. Winifred looked at me, a flash of panic crossing her face, before she angrily retorted, "Are you trying to trick me? Aubrey isn't here. By my calculations, he should still be in hospital." I gave a wry smile, my hand resting on the table. After a few muffled thuds, Aubrey Gower emerged from the hollow space under the dining table. He had been hiding there, hearing every word Winifred had said. The brutal truth was laid bare before Aubrey, and he had no choice but to accept it. His head was still bandaged, but nothing could compare to the pain inflicted by Winifred's words. With bloodshot eyes, he demanded, "Winifred, you were the one who pursued me back then. You were the one who dragged me to the registry office to get married. And now you're telling me you never loved me? Don't you find that ridiculous?" Winifred, however, showed no signs of remorse. It seemed she had long wanted to be rid of Aubrey. There was always a gap between our social standings. If you hadn't taken advantage of my youth and fooled me with your sweet talk, why would I, a Ferrier heiress, ever be with a mechanic like you?" she sneered. "Let me tell you, I belong with Crispin Calvert." Aubrey clenched his fists, looking at the pregnancy test results Winifred had used to entangle me. Suddenly, he let out a laugh, though it was filled with bitterness. "I followed you when you went to forge those pregnancy test results," he said. "At the time, I really thought you were pregnant with our child. I never imagined you'd bribe a doctor just to continue pursuing Mr. Calvert." As he spoke, he took out his phone and played a video he had secretly recorded of Winifred talking to the doctor. "Don't worry, with these test results, I'm sure to become Mrs. Calvert." Winifred's voice rang out from the recording. "When that happens, I'll make sure you're well compensated. Thanks to you, I didn't have to give birth to those little brats." As the video played, Winifred's face fell. She clutched the pregnancy test results tightly, now reduced to a complete joke. Mr. Ferrier could no longer bear to listen. He couldn't believe that the daughter he had carefully raised for years had become like this. In a fit of rage, he rushed forward and slapped Winifred hard across the face, shouting, "You beast! After you married Aubrey, I didn't touch a penny of your assets. That money was enough for you to live comfortably, but you were greedy and never satisfied. You used children to threaten us," he continued. "Do you know your mother was hospitalized because of you? She was in critical condition several times, and you never once came to see her." Winifred stood frozen, holding her reddened cheek. Just as I thought Winifred had given up, she let out a piercing scream and rushed into the kitchen. She grabbed a knife and charged at Aubrey, screaming, "It's all your fault. Everything is because of you. You've ruined my life. Everyone hates me, resents me, wishes I were dead." Aubrey couldn't dodge in time. He barely managed to block Winifred's vicious knife attack with his arm. Blood splattered everywhere as Aubrey howled in pain. Then he too lost his temper. He grabbed Winifred by the throat, wrenched the knife from her hand, and struck with lethal intent, roaring, "You said we'd have a good life together. You can't just empty my family's savings and walk away like nothing happened." Aubrey still had a shred of rationality left. He dragged Winifred out of the room, not wanting her to die inside. Winifred's parents were paralyzed with shock. Mr. Ferrier stayed behind to look after his wife, who had fainted from the shock. I followed Aubrey until we reached the entrance of the estate. I kept my distance. Winifred was still barely alive and looked like she could be saved. I called out to Aubrey, "Aubrey, calm down. I've already called the police. They'll sort this out properly." Aubrey took a deep breath and let out a bitter laugh. Then he plunged the knife into Winifred's heart. "It's too late. Everything's too late," he said. Blood gushed from Winifred's mouth, drowning out her pleas. "No, please." Aubrey stared intently at the dying Winifred, then took his own life in front of her. With his dying breath, Aubrey murmured, "Winifred, you owed me this." When Jillian Dew returned, I had just finished cleaning up the bloodstains in the house. Mr. Ferrier had taken his wife to the hospital. They were emotionally drained, and after leaving the hospital, they would still have to deal with their daughter's funeral arrangements. Jillian was still wearing her awards ceremony gown. Seeing my troubled expression, she asked with concern, "Crispin, what's wrong?" Her gentle call brought my scattered thoughts back to the present. As if possessed, I took out the engagement ring I had prepared long ago and proposed to her right there, at the most inappropriate time and place. I thought she might get angry or question my timing. She did neither. She simply smiled and put on the ring, her face radiating happiness. At that moment, I finally understood. A proposal doesn't need a grand ceremony. All it needs is two people in love.